Everything's on fire. Everything's on fire. Everything's on fire.
Happy Monday, Heat Seekers. We're back, and we're not alone. It's training camp season, so we have some resemblance of football in the midst. We're almost there. September is coming sooner rather than later, and tonight we're going to have fun. For those of you that joined us last week, we had a lot of interesting technical difficulties.
Yeah.
And we are going to continue to talk training camp. So we dabbled a little bit in it last week. We are going to hit it hard. We are going to hit it hardcore, and we're going to hit it hardcore with news and notes. But before we get into that, as always, I'm joined by my man, Kraig Reith. How are you tonight, brother?
Doing good. Some of you know my wife gave birth to our fifth child, our fourth girl, on Saturday afternoon. Everyone is home and healthy and happy, so can't ask for anything better than that. So everything's going well. Everyone is quiet up above for now, and she's hoping to get some rest here as opposed to, we're going to have to wake up every 3 hours or so anyway to get the baby up and everything. But getting some rest while we can, and she can, so it gives me some time to talk some IDP. How are you doing?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm not as good as you because that baby is beautiful. I'm definitely happy for you guys and glad everybody's home and glad to have you tonight. Obviously, we would have gone it as a one-man show, but it's always better when you're around. So I am fine. Otherwise, it was a quiet day. We're ramping up. School's going to be back in here in the next few weeks. So I'm trying to get my kids slowly back into the school mindset and well, that's a challenge. So I'm glad it's Monday night. We're going to talk defense. It's going to be a good one. So we've got a lot of news and notes. A lot of things have been dropping. Some of it fantasy relevant. Some of it maybe redraft team defense fantasy relevant, but maybe not so much IDP relevant. Why don't you get us started and let's talk some news and notes.
So some of this is sort of grouped together in a certain sense, and I'm going to go through a couple of these together. Eagles signed Steve Nelson, formerly of the Steelers, to a one-year deal worth $4 or $5 million. Saints signed Brian Poole to a one-year contract. Cardinals signed Daryl Worley to another short contract. And I think a lot of what you're seeing, all three are cornerbacks. All three of them are probably depth cornerbacks, although depending on how some stuff plays out, they could be pressed into starting stuff. But what you're seeing is with camp starting, a lot of these sort of potential fringe starters and guys that would probably be relevant in the NFL, whether it's signing now or signing in season, probably not fantasy relevant, but they're starting to find homes. And you're going to see more and more of that. There's, a couple trade potential things we're looking at. You just see a lot of that stuff this time of year, as we expect. But it's kind of interesting to start putting people to places. And, some of these can certainly affect other things that we had talked about. The one that I'm thinking of, the Cardinals, we had talked about a number of times that they needed more cornerback help. That was one of their areas of concern. And going into something more fantasy relevant with the Cardinals with that, as Chandler Jones is reportedly unhappy there and looking for a way out. So we'll transition into that. But in regards to the cornerbacks, not a whole lot to see fantasy wise for me. If one of them starts getting picked on, might be a guy to pick up off of waivers, but that's really it for those. How do you see it on the cornerbacks?
Yeah, I don't. Of those guys, I don't see any of them as a fantasy relevant from an IDP perspective. But now that we're getting dangerously close to redraft season, I will say that all three of these add nice depth to these team defenses. Philly needed some corner help, and adding Steve Nelson will at least give them a veteran presence to help that defense. I still think from a redraft perspective, Philly's defense is not one that you're targeting unless it's like a spot start on a flex type situation.
Yeah.
Worley, the Cardinals defense is up and coming. The Chandler Jones news is a bit disheartening. Hopefully they can resolve that because he's better. They're better with him and he's better with them. From a fantasy perspective, the Cardinals were a defense I thought was kind of a sneaky high-end defense too, potentially this year with some of the things they've done. But this move could then push them back down into the 20s for me when it comes to team defenses from a redraft perspective. And then the Saints, the Saints defense is going to continue to be strong. Poole is not an IDP relevant piece, but from a redraft perspective, the Saints team defense is definitely a weekly playable team defense. The concern really is the Michael Thomas side of it. If that defense is on the field for too long in a redraft perspective, the Saints defense will stop being fantasy relevant because they're going to be gassed and they're going to have trouble keeping fantasy production going there because they're just going to get lit up. So you're starting to see some concerns from the Saints, more the offense hurting the defense. But Poole signing will help add veteran depth to them. Kind of way.
Yeah, the only thing that about the Saints that I would caution is, make sure, and who knows if and when with a lot of these guys with legal troubles, but Lattimore still has some legal stuff pending, and if that were to get resolved here one way or the other, and he end up missing games, I think that strength sort of area becomes more of a weakness for him if you have to push someone into starting here, like a guy like Poole, who long-term you really don't want to have being a starter. If that offense starts to sputter, the value of the defense could very well go down.
Absolutely. And for those of you that are with us, I appreciate you guys hanging out with us. If you have questions, offense, defense, whatever related, throw them in the chat. We will take care of you. If you're enjoying what you see here on YouTube, make sure you like, subscribe, do all those things. As we get to redraft season, you're going to start seeing more redraft content. We just did for our Patreon folks a division primer, so we're giving you guys that are important and good fantasy options in the different divisions. We'll be dropping some redraft content for our Patreons, for folks here on YouTube. We're talking about doing some redraft streams again. Last year we streamed on Wednesdays, so we definitely, Z2, we love you and appreciate you hanging out with us. And we hope to help you in all areas. Tonight, we're talking, just training camp primer. We're going to get you ready for training camp. We're going to talk about different players, situations we like right now. Most of these IDP news have not been IDP relevant, but more team defense relevant for redraft. So that's why I'm trying to make sure I preface that so anybody that sees this in the future doesn't think we're all over the place. We are all over the place. We are all over the place, but it's all defense. So, so there's that. So what other news do you want to talk about? What else we got going on?
Yeah, with the Chandler Jones thing, I wanted to get your thoughts on, there's a couple destinations I've seen, and most teams that are contending could use a guy like him. But is there a spot off the top of your head that you could think of where if he went to that you'd really like it? The two, again, I don't know how much you've been digging into the news here lately, but a lot of people are talking potentially Buffalo. There's a couple of ways that he would be able to get fit in there as a defensive end. And then Miami was another interesting one, I thought. So do either of those tickle your fancy? It doesn't appear so, or is there another place that you'd like it better?
The first one I thought was the Chargers. With Melvin Ingram being gone, I don't necessarily like what's going on across from Bosa. I would love to see a guy like Chandler Jones come in and play across from Bosa. That could wreak havoc. But that's the first name that came to mind. Okay. The Chargers are I don't know that they're really ready for that kind of a push in the division they're in to go after a guy like Chandler Jones, but I would love to see him play across from Bosa. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, Jazz, Z2 here in the comments talking about, do you believe the PFF post of Howard for Jones? They weren't really people. They were more of really depth signings. One of them was talking about maybe, in the news article, I forget his name, playing linebacker more, but the Dolphins did go out and get a couple of depth cornerbacks too. They were just, a lot deeper guys that are even farther from being fantasy relevant than ones we went over. Is that sort of a preface for potentially getting rid of Howard? We had talked about that last week where, he was unhappy with the contract. I mean, you really are going to get – you have to, first of all, be happy with
Igbenogany.
Igbenogany. Yep. You'd have to be happy with him, McCourty and Holland, some combo of that at your second cornerback, because I do think there's a drop off this year, even from Howard to one of those two. You would certainly be beefing up that pass rush, with Phillips there, and it'd be a great person for him to learn from. So if they feel that they have a strength in their secondary where they can pull it off, that's great. But, sort of to your point about the Chargers, to a lesser degree, Miami would have to be certain that they're going to be contending, this year or next to go get that sort of a trade accomplished, with what he has for money owed, because he is not a long-term piece there just with his age. And it's sort of feel like, I think most people, it's them in Buffalo right now. I wouldn't count out the Patriots from being feisty. I don't think they're going to win that division, but we've seen them or other teams sort of like Miami play spoiler to the Patriots before, and you could see something, switch up like that and what's going to be, I think, a tight race at the top of that division. So if they're confident and they feel, hey, we can give up this depth for a pass rushing piece that's going to put us over the edge, I could see it. I don't feel it's likely right now is the way I'm feeling on that.
Yeah. For a team like Arizona that has aspirations of making the playoffs, it doesn't make sense to get rid of a guy like Chandler Jones. Like it's like the Packers situation. You really do need to figure out what's going to resolve this and what's going to help make the player happy and the team successful and do that. Like, I don't know why you would be jumping off the Chandler Jones situation.
You would almost be having to think that they keep Hicks and maybe move Collins outside then. Because he has shown that ability to do pass rush. I know they have, I think it's Dennis Gardeck he was really effective in short stints last year rushing the passer, but they would have to be certain that he is capable of a lot more than what he showed last year on a full-time basis if they're getting rid of Jones or someone else out there that they know they can sign, maybe a Melvin Ingram or something, or he signed already, didn't he? Was it Steelers last week?
Ingram.
So he's off, but someone else like that they could get on a cheap year or two deal, you'd have to think that they were confident to get if that's the kind of move that they made.
Well, and when you look at the free agent list, I mean, Justin Houston and Olivier Vernon are about the highest edge rushers left available. So, I mean, so you could get, Everson Griffin, Trent Murphy are also there. I mean, there are options if you wanted to try to do a one-year replacement. It just seems strange. Like Chandler Jones is still a very high-end guy, so I would think you'd want to keep it there. But
him and Watt are. I mean, if they're both healthy, that's going to be a formidable, couple of edge rusher type guys. So I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully,
it'd be nice to see, especially in that division. It'd be fun to see them get after, Matthew Stafford and some of these other quarterbacks there. All right, so our boy Jaws, always good to see you, brother. Heard a bit of information about Keanu Neal's value is pretty well sunk here because we've talked about that a little bit together here in the last few weeks. But what if he does get the LB looks and keeps his safety designation? Next up, they have so many LBs in Dallas, hard to imagine them changing his position. And hey.
So at the moment, it seems like they are set with Dan Quinn moving him to a linebacker position. They are, depending on who you look at, but it kind of feels like it's going to be Smith, Neal, and I'm going to guess Parsons as probably their three main linebackers you're going to be starting with this year. I think Van Der Esch, for his own sake and for what the team's looking at, is probably going to be on sort of that second unit to start the year, especially if Parsons continues the way that he's been playing in camp. I mean, they had him, and this is the time where they try a lot of different stuff, especially with rookies. There's guys sitting out, guys not healthy to play, but they even had Parsons rushing the passer from the defensive tackle position at one point. Parsons has looked great in coverage, which is pretty much the one concern that people sort of had out of him. Yeah, I know. Look, we're just starting. It's early on. But if Parsons is going to be showing this now and is able to play like that, there's no way they're going to be able to keep him off of the field. Smith isn't being kept off of the field with the money that they're paying him and Jerry liking him for at least this year. And I think Neal is the other guy that Quinn really wants to have out there because he gives you that flexibility. He can play sort of that, like we saw last year, Jeremy Chin hybrid safety linebacker role. Donovan Wilson seems like the strong safety that they're going to be going with. He played well for him last year. And that's kind of Neal's position. That other safety is up in the air. They do have Kazee. I think we talked about this briefly last week. But one of the other things, they're looking at, and it seems at the moment kind of likely they might sign Malik Hooker, who's probably going to be at a cheap deal given he hasn't been able to stay healthy. But he was another guy that was highly drafted, showed a lot in college, and just hasn't been able to completely put it together. So if they go get someone like him, even if they don't, I'm not sure that they would be able to play Neal and Wilson that well together at safety.
Well, the thing that, and I trust this is your team, so I know that you're definitely more paying attention to them. I'm excited for Hard Knocks this year to see a little bit behind the curtain in some areas for him. But Dan Quinn as a defensive mind, I think he's going to help bring a lot of fantasy relevance to these guys. Now, the early reports that I've read, and I went back to pull up my article that I was reading it on, over on the Cowboys site was, they're looking at Neal and Cox as kind of the space linebackers. So you're going to see if these are guys that are playing in space, you're going to see opportunities for them to jump routes and maybe get some interceptions, do some things like that. Keanu Neal, I think I would trust more in that position because of his speed and his ability to keep up with those guys and get some interceptions. That Jaws, I would not be hesitant to keep him on my roster. I have no problem leaving him as a depth piece to see how they deploy him. If they do that, then he gets you some big plays. Maybe he could be a spot starter. Maybe he gets a little more involved because they're really only looking at Neal and Cox as kind of the guys in space at the moment. So I am perfectly fine with rostering him at this point because the talent's there. We know that injuries have derailed him and some things like that. And then if they do add a player, if they add a guy like Malik Hooker, and there's some other safeties out there if they're really looking for safety help. Malik Hooker's still young enough that if he can beat that injury bug and really develop, great. He's only 25 or 26. I mean, he could still be valuable for quite a while. And he was a guy that was highly drafted, and everybody really liked him coming out of Ohio State. So he's a guy that if somebody will pick him up. Yeah. Like there's no doubt that he won't be on a roster. So it's win. And I would take a shot on him on your deep IDP leagues, throw him on the back of your roster and see what happens. Safeties, linebackers, those are both very tough positions that if you can find some sneaky value, you could flip it or you could use it in a pinch. Injuries happen every year. So
the only thing that I'd caution is from what I've seen, and this is through at least 3 different sites. I don't know off the top of my head what MFL is doing, but Neal, from what I've seen, most places does just seem to have linebacker designation at the moment. He doesn't have the dual just because of what Dallas has said. So if you can find a place where you can get it, that's great. But I would caution you that may just be going away too.
Right. No, that could very well be. I'm just looking through the free agent list. There's not a lot of safeties of when you look at Hooker's skill set, there's nobody that really can hang with him. I mean, Trey Boston, Kenny Vaccaro, I mean, these are aging safeties, so this guy really does kind of have the market that whoever's in a pinch, he could be on a team very quickly and put into a position that gets some playing time. So definitely roster him as well. And Keanu Neal, I could easily, by the year's end, you could easily, in my mind, if somebody said, oh, well, they moved him back to safety and he's starting with Donovan Wilson. Okay. I mean, that wouldn't surprise me. He's definitely got the ability and the range to play safety. So you put your best players on the field. And if he is still one of the best players in that back half of the team, he'll be on the field.
Yeah.
Just the way it works. All right. So what other news? I'm just looking.
Yeah, we had 2 main ones here, sort of, and they're similar in what happened and who they are, although the money is different. Sam Hubbard re-signed. He signed an extension, rather, 4-year, $40 million extension. And then Jonathan Allen, defensive tackle as opposed to defensive end, a 4-year, $72 million extension, which I think they're re-signing some of these pieces in Washington while they can because Sweat and then Young are going to be expensive down the road. But how do you feel about both these? You can start with either one here.
I like them both. I was just trying to look up the fantasy relevance of Jonathan Allen. I mean, he's a force at the defensive tackle position. Yeah. I think he's one of those guys that if you're in defensive tackle specifically, you like this move because he will continue to be relevant because there's no way you can double anybody on this defensive line. You've got Sweat, you've got Allen, you've got Deron Payne, you've got Chase Young, you've got depth on that defensive line as well. I mean, there's plenty of pieces that, that's a good thing. I like Allen. I don't know in defensive tackle specifically, because I don't know that you trade for him because those types of guys are a little harder to acquire, at least a little bit that I've tried to acquire. Sam Hubbard, on the other hand, you should be able to still get at a fairly reasonable price, and now would be the time to buy if you like him. I'm a big fan. I've liked him for probably 3 years now. I would jump all over it if you can get him because, we were talking pre-show a little bit that Cincinnati is one of those teams that if everybody can stay healthy and take that next step, I mean, they're ready to start being in the conversation and being relevant in their division. That's a good defense that's got some young pieces that are really on the cusp if they could just put it together. And Hubbard's a big piece of that. He's got a good motor. He can get off there and attack the quarterback, get you sacks, get you, forced fumbles, things like that, and then you throw a guy like Trey Hendrickson from New Orleans across from him. You've got, Joseph Asai. I know pre-draft I liked. I wasn't huge on, but I think as a true pass rusher, he could do it. He's got the speed. Then they have Reeder and Ogunjobi in the defensive tackle positions. Like, this defensive line is not something to slouch on. So what's your take on these two guys, and what are you doing with them?
Yeah, Hubbard I have in a couple places, and I'm really hoping for a bounce back right now. He's one of those guys where he is sort of, at least over the first 2 years, which is really what we're looking at here. He had a nice number of sacks. He had 6, 8.5. Tackles went up a lot in his second year from 39 to 76 overall, sort of evened out even in a down year at 62. I think his ceiling is, flirting with that sort of double-digit sacks, and he could probably maintain or even increase those tackles a little bit, because he is more of a guy, a defensive end or edge guy that's going to help you in leagues where tackles matter more than big plays. I think he could improve there, but he is sort of one of those sort of lunch pail guys where he gives a high level of effort. He tries, really hard. He knows what to do, but he isn't just one of those pure pass rushers like, someone like Chandler Jones that we were talking about, where you could, if he's healthy regularly, you're going to get, 12 to 15 sacks out of him is what you'd be hoping for. So because of that, not big, flashy, gaudy numbers in a down year last year, I think, to your point, you could get him at a discount. And I know there was a question in there about, where we rank him. I wish I could tell you that I had my rankings memorized off the top of my head. I know some people do, and Lord knows I have Paw Patrol and Doc McStuffins stuck in my head more than where exactly I have my rankings. But I think I don't know if you can get them up on the screen there, Brad.
I'm pulling them up.
All right.
Give me 1 second.
So he's a guy that we both like, and I think he's sort of more of a steady presence than a big go big or go home type of option. But that certainly does have value unless you play in sort of big play specific leagues. And I know I don't know about your leagues, Brad, but most of my leagues usually try to keep it fairly well balanced, not only across positions, but also in terms of how plays are graded as far as tackles, balancing that out.
So we have him at 46 overall from an IDP perspective, just after Harold Landry and just before J.J. Watt.
And those are dynasty, of course.
Yes, this is a dynasty situation for sure.
So these aren't.
And you guys that are over in the chat, I'll throw the link to where I'm looking at. So if y'all want to check it out yourself and see our rankings, you can. You can even sort it, and see where Kraig has them as opposed to where I have them.
We are updating those.
Yeah, we update them on the regular as well. Yeah. So Kraig has him at 40. I actually have him at 67. So I guess I'm lower on him than you are. But I'm sure that'll change, especially with this news. Re-signing, that means they're going to keep him as their starter for basically till he's 30. So
that's basically it for our news and notes in the past week or so here for IDP. We have plenty of offensive news. Brad and Sully will be hitting tomorrow night.
Yeah. We got our boy Taylor's coming back home. We're gonna have our boy Taylor on tomorrow night, so that'll be fun.
And maybe news isn't all completely right. There's a lot of news and speculation, I guess, is the other part. Although maybe by tomorrow night this time, it will be news for the rest of you. So
now that training camps are opening, tomorrow is everybody's in. I mean, you've started seeing rookies report in a lot of teams, but tomorrow everybody reports. Veterans, folks that haven't had their rookies come in yet. I mean, tomorrow we will have all training camps open, everybody going hardcore. So it'll be fun to see, getting everybody back in, getting the teams back together, and seeing where things go. Preseason's right around the corner. Hall of Fame inductions and the games are coming. So. So that's all the news and notes in 25 minutes or less. If you guys have questions, throw them in the chat. Again, if you have offense, defense, whatever, we'll answer you. We'll do our best to help you out. We have been dropping a ton of player outlooks. I know last week there was a lot of news around LA with the Akers situation. We've dropped player outlooks over on YouTube. So go to YouTube, search Roto Heat. You'll find us. Like, subscribe, do that. You can see we did one for Funk. We did one for Xavier Jones. We got a Darrell Henderson. There's a lot of player outlooks over there. So make sure you go over there and take a look. Now, last week when we were talking, we really focused kind of on the big on the big conversations with like Houston, and we talked some Dallas and Detroit. When it comes to the rest of the league, because we didn't get into a lot of it. Obviously, things are starting to take shape. We're hearing rumors. Green Bay looks like the band's getting back together. They probably will have things worked out. But what are some of the storylines, some of the things that you're getting excited about as we come into training camp? What are you looking for? Is there anything from a defensive perspective that you're excited about or want some clarity on? What comes to mind first that we didn't talk about last week?
Yeah, so you're going to be seeing position battles across the league, and a lot of these are probably guys that you're not completely excited about, but are going to be fantasy relevant. One of the phrases that I've heard a lot from talking with other IDP guys is relevant by default. If you're the main guy in the middle, even if you aren't necessarily the most talented or the best, if you're on the field and you're playing in the middle on one of these defenses, you're going to be fantasy relevant for some team if you're playing in a league that's 10 to 12 teams and where you start 2 to 3 linebackers if they have a flex, or even more than that. So one of these battles that I'm looking at, we touched on a little bit for the defensive line, but it's the Cincinnati Bengals. Interestingly, they sort of have what they had last year. They have some guys taken away, but they haven't added a whole lot to this linebacking core. You have Akeem Davis-Gaither, who they got last year, 2020 in the 4th. They have the third round pick in 2020, yep. Logan Wilson, who we had touched on last year, but didn't do a whole lot overall. Same thing with Jermaine Pratt, third round pick in 2019, hasn't done a whole lot. But they don't have a whole lot for depth right now. We could see that change. But sort of that main guy in the middle, whoever that ends up being, is probably who you're going to want. But I do want to see how that plays out, because Pratt honestly hasn't been great in his career and hasn't shown a whole lot, certainly not what they want of a third-round pick. And I think there will be a battle between Pratt and Wilson for whoever that main guy in the middle is, with the other bouncing outside. So that is one that I'm definitely keeping an eye on, because that is cheap talent you can get later in a draft, and whoever is in that middle for, whenever they play, if they end up switching off, sort of like the Rams have done with their safeties in the past due to injuries or whatever, you're going to have to be paying attention to that and know who's starting. But that starter in the middle there, especially with an improved defensive line and a secondary who I think is underrated, there's going to be tackles to be had.
Well, and I do, our lads is typically one of the places I look for depth charts. I do like how they try to keep things updated, but I loved, as I was looking at Cincy tonight prepping for the show, they don't have a Mike, they don't have a Will, they don't have a Sam. It just says linebacker. Even sites that are guessing what they're going to do have no idea. So right now, the top 3 linebackers are, the second, third year guys over the last couple of years that were drafted. But this is a team where I could fully see them go out and get somebody, and it wouldn't surprise me in the least. If they're a team that thinks that they can make a push for the AFC North and be a contender in it, maybe things are getting to the point where they feel like they've got a good shot. They could go get a veteran free agent linebacker. I know KJ Wright's still sitting out there. I've got it up. Who else is out there at linebacker? Kwan Alexander, who's 27,
he's
is
healthy.
Still, yeah, and he's healthy. They have BJ Goodson, Todd Davis, some veteran guys, Michael Kendricks, another veteran guy that could step in and help. So if these young guys aren't ready to really take that next step, there's some options out there to really jump in and help. But I hope they do, because I think all 3 of these guys, Gaither, Pratt, and Wilson, I think all have the physical tools, the ability to get sideline to sideline, the ability to pop back into coverage and be something back there as well, that they all could develop in some way, shape, or form. I think my favorite of the three is probably Wilson, but Pratt and Wilson are kind of right there for me. Like I want shares of both of them because I think they both could really develop into probably not LB1s, but maybe high-end LB2s, like guys that you're comfortable putting in your lineup on a regular basis. But I just don't think they're there yet. So I want them as depth pieces to see how they develop.
Yeah, and I feel that way for this year, barring them signing anyone, but it really just feels long-term to me like a spot where they have to find someone, where they go out and spend a higher draft pick on one of these guys coming out because they've been sort of, throwing around pieces in the, third and fourth round here and not really going and getting a guy. And it almost feels like if this offense takes a step forward, this defensive line improves and the secondary continues to be nice, they're just going to have to find linebacker to sort of fill that out.
Absolutely will. I mean, and even, like you mentioned before, I mean, the depth is super weak. Jordan Evans is really the only guy that's had experience. Otherwise, it's just rough. So I would say they're in an interesting spot, but they definitely have room to improve. And I don't know why they don't have any veteran leadership in that linebacker group. I mean, they really could use some.
Who are you looking at here for another team or another positional battle, Brad?
As I was looking through and trying to figure that out, right now there's so many teams that I have questions on. So it's our boy off the schneid. Linebackers never really been a priority for my Bengals, unfortunately. It hasn't been, but the team has had so many other holes that they can't focus on linebacker because linebacker is more of a you have to build the trenches. You have to build, your quarterbacks, some of your skill positions. I mean, linebackers kind of lower down the list. So they're going to be targeting it. They have to soon because the rest of the team is developing and growing and they've put some high capital in it. And they really, I mean, a third rounder in 19 and third rounder in 20 is still pretty high draft capital to spend on linebackers. So, there's something there.
Yeah, the last one I can remember off the top of my head was Perfect. And he had some up and down years, but I mean, he had a couple really nice years, but even that, I mean, 2016, that's 5-6 years ago now since they had a guy and he had his own issues. But for fantasy, he had some nice years there, but it's been a while. I agree.
That has absolutely been a while. So like I was saying, when I was looking back through and trying to prepare for tonight, like every team I would look at, I'm like, oh, well, I've got a question about such and such. So it really, we could have done all 32 teams and have questions that I'm really interested to find out the answer to. But Jacksonville is going to be the one that I want to talk about next. The Urban Meyer experiment will be really interesting. I know Joe Cullen's running the defense and that'll be, I think they're probably going to lean more. I really don't know exactly what this is going to look like with the players that they have. I think they need help along the defensive line in the middle because, they drafted Jay Tufele. They had, first rounder Taven Bryan, Hamilton.
Traded for Malcolm Brown.
Yeah, they traded for Malcolm Brown. They have Hamilton, so they have some guys that if they could develop could be really interesting from an IDP perspective. Where defensive tackle specific play needs to be involved. They have some guys that I'm really intrigued by to see what happens because they've never really developed fully. And then you have, on the edge side of things, Josh Allen, Kayvon Chason. I mean, this whole defensive line, like there's so much intrigue to it, but it's just never really come to fruition. So that's kind of one of the positions that I want to see, but I want to see how the Urban Meyer experiment plays out. How involved is he in play calling? Like what level does he get involved with offense, defense, all of that? Does he trust his coordinators to do what their jobs? I'm really fascinated by this team as a whole just to see how this works.
Yeah, and I mean, sort of the opposite of what we just talked about with Cincinnati. For the most part, the linebacking core feels like the strength where they have that sorted out the most. Right. In the Jaguars because they're secondary. And they have so many guys that they started last year due to injuries and just due to a dearth of talent at the time, it felt, compared to other teams. They had Josh Jones start. They had Wilson start. Wingard started for them. They went out, they drafted Cisco. They signed Rayshon Jenkins to a pretty sizable deal where it's feeling like, hey, he's a guy who's probably going to start. He's bounced around as far as position-wise, but assuming that they're going to mainly have two safeties on the field, even if they're using them as interchangeable pieces, who is that other one? They've just used so many different pieces back there. And again, I think that's one that could be fantasy relevant here because they do have two nice linebackers. But that whole team, by and large, outside of, Schobert and Jack, it's a young team that's going to be going through growing pains. And while I think they have a lot of talent on that offense, it remains to be seen, to your point with Urban on that offensive side. Are they going to be able to keep the ball, have drives, or is it a defense that's just going to be on the field a lot again?
And if that is the problem, defenses will get gassed, and it will really it's going to be a struggle. I like the way this team is going. I think they have a lot of talent on both sides that it'll be fascinating to me to see what they do with it, if they really can. Obviously this isn't the offensive show, but there's plenty of questions even on that side of the ball in the trenches. When I was talking defensive line, on the offensive line side of things, there's just some fascinating battles that, how does any of these offensive linemen, what five really wind up being the five, and the same goes in the secondary, like you said, and I think it's very underrated, the signing of Shaq Griffin from Seattle. Like, that dude is a very solid starting corner, and putting him, across from, and I don't even, and that's the tough thing, is I don't even know who the number two is going to be. They have Sidney Jones,
Tyson was good last year.
Yeah, Herndon, Tyson Campbell. They've got plenty of options at corner. Like, this team could all of a sudden be in the conversation, competing in the AFC South when, it's Tennessee, Indy should be there. We know Houston's at the bottom, so Jacksonville, can they compete with these other teams that have been, at the top here for the last few years?
Yeah, I think they can be feisty, pull an upset here or there. But if Wentz is even Phillip Rivers level from last year, I think that they're going to be, the second team clearly, barring crazy injuries, blah, blah, blah. But
right.
We would really want to, even with a rookie quarterback and a new head coach, that's an experienced head coach. That is a, renowned, and for good reason, quarterback coming into the NFL. It feels like he had been the number one quarterback of this draft class just by appointment for 3-4 years. So the expectations are going to be high. And while I don't see them probably competing for the division right now, if they aren't even showing that they're feisty, I would be worried. And maybe that's a stretch, but with all that offensive talent and supposedly such a great mind as a head coach, I'm going to want to see something out of him to have hope for if I'm a Jaguars fan.
Absolutely. So I'm just looking over Jacksonville's roster to see if there's anything else that, and I'm ready to see Andre Cisco step into the starting role.
I really want him to. I like him a lot.
I do. Yeah. I think he'll do a good job. It would be nice to see him and Rayshawn Jenkins kind of be their top two. And then you can have whomever you want as the number three when they go into those packages, Josh Jones, Gerard Wilson, Daniel Thomas, Rudy Ford. Wingard's still there. I'm not a big Wingard guy. Veteran leadership kind of guy, but I'm just not a big fan fantasy wise.
Well, I got another one I want to ask you about because I have my own actual thoughts on this up here in the land of cheese and beer. We won't be talking about the 2021 NBA champion Milwaukee Bucks. We will be talking about the Packers and not talking about the offensive chaos that they seem to just be throwing out on the daily. Whether it's Bakhtiari at Rodgers, playful or not, or Rodgers telling someone this but then telling someone else that. You guys can save that for tomorrow. I want to know your thoughts on this inside linebacker situation because they have some interesting guys. Summers a couple of years ago was a late round pick. They have Burks from 18 was a third round. Barnes was a free agent last year. And then the guy that I really interested in, Kamal Martin. So they're going to have, two of these guys, and whether one of them or both of them decide to show up, whoever the starters are, that is. We know it's a position with that defensive line and those edge rushers, sort of like what we talked about earlier. could be a really productive position, whether it's by default or someone decides to start showing out. So who do you, if you had to throw your money behind one of these guys, so to speak, of those four on the inside, who are you liking the most?
If you'd asked me this last year at this time, I would have said Oren Burks. I really liked him this year. I don't, not so much. I like Kamal Martin. Kid came out last year. He was a Big Ten kid.
Minnesota, yep.
Yeah, Minnesota. The interesting thing for me will be, if I remember correctly, and I'd have to pull up notes from the class. Like I remember his athleticism being the thing I was a little concerned with. But if you pair him with somebody like Barnes or Burks, who have the athletic ability, and Martin's more of your just your thumper. For those of you guys big on this class, the Nick Bolton type, who maybe not have the strongest physical tools, but just as a wrecker when it comes to tackling. Like Kamal Martin's a good tackler, and I think he could really rack those up for you from an IDP perspective. I would have to dig into my notes exactly to see what my concerns were. But if I remember correctly, that was the biggest thing for me in last year's class. So I think he's in a perfect spot because when you look at the depth on this team and what they even have at linebacker, like he's probably the most talented and best tackler they have at the inside linebacker position. So you think he has to start. I mean, he kind of has to be one of the de facto guys. Barnes showed fairly well last year, so you'd think he'd be the guy that would get another opportunity as well. But the guy with the highest draft capital is Burks. I mean, Burks was a third-round pick. So,
yep.
So those three are the three that I would anticipate. But this is, again, another team that if they went out and made a trade or brought in a veteran, it would not surprise me in the least bit. This is a team that actually can say we've got Super Bowl aspirations. So they really do need to make sure that they're shored up in every position because there really isn't. There may not be a tomorrow for them. They may lose their franchise quarterback after this year.
Yeah, and I mean they did go out, and I think he's more of a depth piece for the edge. But I mean, potentially Campbell could play inside too in a pinch if they decided.
Oh yeah,
Devondre, yeah. But he just feels more like I think we talked about this at the time, a sort of a super utility backup where you can play him wherever that you need to. Martin, I wrote about him. He's sort of my guy. Yeah, he has to get better in coverage. But out of the Packer linebackers from last year, he's either the best or the second best in terms of what he showed in terms of rating, and we know that's not the be-all, end-all. But also just in terms of rookie linebackers last year that played over that threshold number of snaps. And I think he barely beat it because he got hurt, and we know that they missed out on camp. So, he missed a significant amount of time last year. But for the time that he was on the field, he played really well, especially for a fifth-round pick. And I know that they were excited about him going into the year. And it sounds like it's the same, with what he showed last year. They think they found sort of a diamond in the rough back there in the fifth round. So I'm excited to see him for basically what is a free price in most leagues.
For sure. Well, and I was trying to pull up my document on him, and I mean, the biggest thing I put is he fits better in a 3-4 as an inside linebacker. So he's in the perfect spot, in my mind, at least my 2020 mind.
Back a year or two.
I haven't revisited my notes or time traveled to ask myself what I was thinking, but he's in the perfect spot and he's in the perfect situation because they don't, like we mentioned, I mean, the way the team is built, it's his for the taking. He's just got to, he's just got to come in and work his tail off and continue to develop. The things that he struggled with dropping back into coverage and some of those things, you can teach some of that. Now, the athletic ability, I mean, you're only, you are what you are, but you can teach, knowing the routes, understanding what the offense is doing, like those things he can grow in. So if him and Barnes are their guys from day one, Kamal Martin will probably wind up being a better fantasy asset at the year's end, would be my guess.
I agree.
Okay, so what division have we ignored? Let's see here. We talked some AFC North tonight. We dabbled a little in the East. We've dipped our toes in the South. You know what? We haven't talked about the West very much. Let's talk Denver. We haven't talked Denver Broncos. I've got questions about everybody. Denver Broncos defense, there's plenty of questions. So I'm going to pull their – all right. So this is what we're looking at for their depth chart. So they've got Shelby Harris, Mike Purcell, Draymond Jones. That is just the who's who of yuck along the defensive line.
Oh, come on now.
I'll be honest. Shelby Harris is about the only one that I'm Draymond Jones, I just don't know that he can develop. 3-4, edge guy.
Michigan guy hating on an Ohio State player. Come on.
I know, right?
The tale as old as time.
That team down there, I don't like them. But so when you look at that, then your linebackers, there's some appeal here. We have the man, the myth, the Vaughn. We've got some Chubb. We've got some Alexander Johnson, and then Josie.
Watch what you say about Chubb here, Brad. Family show.
We got Josie Jewell, who is the best 90s throwback linebacker in the NFL. He would have been amazing playing the Chris Spielman role in Detroit 20 years ago. Baron Browning, sound pup currently. They've got a little bit of depth here at the linebacker position. Then you look at secondary. Kareem Jackson still holding down the fort back there with Justin Simmons. Who didn't he just get re-signed? I think he got re-signed here this offseason, right?
I think so, but that's going to be a mean secondary.
That's a mean secondary. They have Patrick Surtain. They got Kyle Fuller from Chicago. Ronald Darby is your nickelback. They got a little depth here. Bryce Callahan, Duke Dawson, Michael Ujimudie was a guy I liked a lot last year. Yeah. Would love to see him develop a little bit. I mean, this defense is intriguing from an IDP perspective. I mean, there's some concerns, but how do you feel about this secondary? Is there anything that stands out to you? Or this defense as a whole? Anything that stands out to you?
The secondary to me speaks for itself. I mean, I would argue that's one of the best top to bottom, including depth secondaries in the league right now. And then you pair that with what could be, assuming they're both healthy, a really dangerous pass rush. You can tell how they created that defense. And you can see why someone like Aaron Rodgers allegedly wants to go there and play, aside from the fact that Elway supposedly said he would get the Peyton Manning treatment where he gets to sort of make personnel decisions and run the offense. I get that. The biggest question for me, and I think we differ on this a little bit, but that's all right, is that inside linebacker position. I like Alexander, but once you get beyond that, it's just a lot of for me. Jewell, I mean, just isn't anything great, to your point. Sternad, last year they had hopes for him, but I'm pretty sure he got hurt relatively early, like just as soon as he got the position, he got hurt and was out with an ankle injury or something like that. Browning, I think, is really interesting because he was a high recruit out of high school into college, and he's a great athlete, but he just never put it together. Sort of like the opposite, I'd say, of Pete Werner, who went to the Saints and is looking to compete, where Werner, he's a fine athlete, but I think he's just a lot more cerebral and knows the position, just more of a well-rounded, closer towards the lunch pail sort of end of the scale, as opposed to Browning, who's, to me, much farther on the athletic side, but doesn't have all that cerebral stuff because he didn't play a lot in college. I mean, he was hurt quite a bit. So I do find him interesting, but on what looks to be a veteran defense, again, are you going to be plugging sort of like the Packers thing, a rookie in there, or, a second-year guy to be the guy? I mean, that's going to be interesting to find out. Draymond Jones, we're going to differ on him, and that's fine. He only had like a 51% snap share. He came on later in the year, but he had a good season. He rated really well. And, someone like even Harris on the other side, who isn't a world beater but had a nice season, is able to have good games. You add those two as sort of on that defensive line, holding their ground on the edge, but also able to go get to the quarterback like, Jones showed last year. I really like him as a defensive guy. And if you're looking at leagues that have the edge position, Jones is an interior lineman, which I like him even better in. If you're looking at that sort of the flat defensive line position, yeah, he's going to end up farther down on that. But me personally, most of my leagues are moving towards that interior line edge position, which I like. he is still someone to keep an eye on. You wouldn't be drafting him unless you're in a super deep league that has those base defensive line positions. But he's the guy on the defensive line to own out of anyone for me.
There you go. I don't know that we agree.
No,
I don't know that we don't
always agree.
We'll let
We got a
time
question in the
tell.
chat, though. I think
We do. We are. We're gonna jump over. Our boy Brian over on YouTube. Welcome, brother. Off topic. Does Devin Bush ever live up to the hype? Drafted him as a rookie over Devin White. Sad day. Bush talks a lot for a guy who has not done anything in the league. He did that same bit at Michigan. He was a lot of talk. He did provide a lot of action, though, in Michigan, which is why he got drafted so highly. Kraig, what do you think? Is he going to – I mean, obviously we know he's a starter in Pittsburgh. It'll be him, and I mean, the tough thing is they typically are a 3-4, and, I mean, Robert Spillane is next to him. I mean, it's tough.
I think we had missed that last week. I don't know if we touched on it or not. Probably not with all of my technical difficulties. But Vince Williams, who they had just retired shortly after he resigned there, and I don't think that was really expected. So, and then they went on and signed Ingrams, who's probably going to be more of a designated pass rusher with Highsmith and on more of the passing downs. But I think Highsmith is a good chance to be the guy there more so. To his point, actually, in that draft, I took Devin White 4 spots in my own main IDP league ahead of Devin Bush, and I ended up with both of them now on my team because I got Bush pretty cheap because someone got sick of him, which I don't mind. If you're going to get someone to give you a cheap flyer on a guy that's drafted that high, I think it's worth it. And to your point, Bush is going to start. He will have that opportunity just because they still have a very good defensive line. They're still going to have an above-average pass rush, and that division just loves to run the ball. You have Baltimore. You have Cleveland, who we know both of them are just going to pound the ball. And I think Cincinnati's going to have to find more balance and run the ball more because they, as we learned last year, they cannot just keep putting Burrow out to the wolves because it doesn't end well.
Very true.
So will he live up to it? I don't know. But to friend of the show, off the Schneid's point of view, if you're looking for a depth guy in a league, in a rookie draft, we have a deep bench of taxis. Buddy Johnson is really interesting because he sort of, to me, fits that Pittsburgh Steeler profile of a linebacker probably more than Devin Bush does with just he has that athletic bit, but he is just more of a hardworking, no-nonsense, shut up and play. And to Brian's last point, if I hadn't gotten Devin Bush cheap, I wouldn't have gotten him at all because by and large, I don't like rostering guys that I just don't enjoy. And Devin Bush just seems a bit like a fool just in the way that he acts out in the world. Yes, he could kick my butt and, he's a billion times better than I am at football. But I'm not the biggest fan of him, and I generally don't like rostering guys that I don't like. So.
Yeah, so Devin Bush has always been a guy where, he plays bigger than his size. At 5'11", he's a smaller guy, but, I mean, he's a missile. Good speed, a good tackler. The injuries are going to be an issue for him. I wrestle with what to do with Devin Bush long-term because I love him. The defense is perfect fit for him because he could have a bigger, more a bigger guy next to him to help offset and take on some of those offensive linemen so that he can shoot the gaps or maybe bounce out into coverage and handle some of the space. So far, we've seen a mixed bag. His rookie season and his earlier part of his time in Pittsburgh's been interesting. Last year, obviously, we didn't get to see if he keeps growing and developing because of the injury. I don't think that you can be out on him yet if you were a guy that liked him. But there are better options. Obviously, Devin White, in that draft, it was really pick your poison. I mean, they're both really highly touted, and everybody was excited. So I don't blame anybody that went with Bush over White or White over Bush, either or. If I have Devin Bush, I'm going to sit on him and I'm going to see what happens because I think that he can still develop into a fantasy asset. He's not a likable guy, to Craig's point. The guys that can be a little bit more mouthy can get on people's nerves, and that's part of their whole shtick. I mean, when I played ball, like, you ran your mouth. I mean, you tried to get in the person's head so you could try to get them off their game and win your battle. So I don't blame the guy for what he's doing. It just is what it is. But I try to not have too many guys on my roster that I think are concerns. And if you have things like that have either injury concerns or character concerns, you got to be careful, because that could really hurt your fantasy roster long term. I know Rick would smack me for saying injuries on a show about fantasy, but Brian, I say sit, see what happens, but make sure you've got depth. Target, like our boy said, Buddy Johnson, or some of these other linebackers. Get yourself some guys as some depth pieces just to be safe. And unless you get the right deal, I mean, sure, like Scott Fish says, trading makes fantasy fun.
And I mean, to Brian's point about us having him high up in the rankings, I mean, his talent and what he's done in the NFL, it hasn't been amazing, but there was a year of injuries, and I think there's part of what we run into is a comparison of him to Devin White. The other thing to remember with that is Devin White is on a team where I think that defense as a whole is better than the Steelers. I mean, I think there are some comparisons where, their defensive lines are strong. They have great edge rushers. They have nice linebackers. But Devin White's production last year was bolstered by and large by, for an inside linebacker, a very high number of sacks and tackles for a loss, which long-term I don't think is repeatable. I still like him more than Devin Bush long-term. If you're looking for this year, I don't think Devin White's going to repeat how high. He was a top 1 or 2, and it's going to vary again if you have those edge guys included in or not. But if you're just looking inside, he was the top 1 or 2. I think he falls down a little bit more than that. And Bush, he's going to be higher than where he was last year because, knock on wood, he's not going to be injured, I don't think, like he was last year. But Devin Bush certainly has a talent. So I don't try to knock people in my rankings because I don't like them. It's more of if I'm building my team and, if I have Bush next to someone else, we'll throw out Isaiah Simmons or someone just for the fun of it. I like Simmons more from Bush. So I'd probably take Simmons over Bush if it's the same sort of tier and where I'm drafting those guys. That was what I meant by that.
Yep. So there you go. Oh, Jaws has a question. Chance Michael Walker breaks into the starting and relevance in Atlanta.
Well, there's always a chance.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
We live in a world where there's all sorts of chances.
We live in a world. We do.
Most of us.
Where there's chances.
We live in a multiverse, some people would say.
They would. If
you're talking about best case scenario, I don't think he's fantasy relevant this year. The two guys they have there, Deion Jones is clearly the stud there for me, and Foye Oluokun has shown himself to be very productive as well as a second linebacker. Part of what you run into is that defensive line is just not great. They have Jarrett and just a whole lot of fantasy-wise yuck next to him. So they're able to sort of focus on Jarrett, and even that secondary, it feels like a mess. So you have the heart of the team at those two linebackers who showed last year that even if one of them is injured, like in prior years, they can just eat. So depending on how deep your league is there a chance that Walker breaks in? Sure. Do I think it happens this year? No. Brad?
And I just posted our link to Discord in the chat. If you guys have questions, because I know the show is going to end soon. If you guys have questions, IDP, offense, defense, Devi, whatever questions, join Discord. Keep the conversation going. You guys see us chatting in there every day, all day, all the time. So just putting that out there. Michael Walker, I think, is an interesting situation because there's not much he has to leapfrog to get playing time. We know Deion Jones is the man, and Oluokun should be the other guy, but he could be involved in this rotation. But the tough thing is, remember, this isn't the staff that drafted him. I mean, most of these guys on this roster are from the prior regime. So, how does Walker fit in with them is the interesting question. I think Walker, if you have deep rosters, you could roster him and see what happens because he's kind of in the next man up situation, but I don't know that he's fantasy relevant this year.
Next year, if you believe in him and you have that room, keep him because Olakun's a free agent after this year.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're thinking that they're going to move on from him, I mean, they did just get him in the 4th round. Walker, was that 2020 or is he a rookie this year? My mind is all over the place. I think he's a rookie, isn't he?
Who? Walker? Oh, he was last year rookie.
Last year? All right. But still, I mean, he's under contract cheaply. That Falcons team is going to have to figure a lot of stuff out. If they do decide to go to sort of a cheap youth movement, there's no reason that next year he couldn't possibly start next to Jones, which we've seen is a good position to be in.
Absolutely a very good position to be in because Jones will get all the action or get all the attention, and your guy, whomever that would be, Walker, whomever, could eat. So there you go, Josh. Hopefully that helps. As always, if you guys have questions, hit us up. You know, our Twitter handles are just dangling a little bit here at the bottom of our screens. And that's it. It's 10:30 Eastern Central Time. I don't know what time it is where you are. Hopefully it's all going well either way. We're here, people. It's training camp season. All these questions that we've been bringing up will be answered. We'll have live at game action in just over a month.
Yep.
And stick with us. If you guys have questions, we're here every Monday night talking IDP. Once we get into the season, you know, the streams pick up and we add redraft and there'll be DFS. We got lots of stuff coming as we get to the season. We thank you guys as always for hanging out with us. YouTube, like, subscribe, do all those things. And Kraig.
Next week, Brad will be incorrect. He will prove to be incorrect. So, just so you know, not every week are we talking about IDP. If you do play team defenses next week, yes, we will go into it for you, even though this is an IDP stream. We will be discussing team defenses, probably mainly, for redraft leagues, because team defenses in dynasty leagues is a horse that I can't ride with personally. But in redraft, yes, I still have one. It's a work league that I can't get them to get rid of them. And every year I do try to bring up, hey, let's get IDP. And there's even just one IDP guy. And they're like, nope, not doing it with you. So I do have to survive team defenses. So if you have questions about those, join us next week.
Yeah. And I try to keep some leagues that do that because I do, I don't know if it's the nostalgia feeling. I was replying to a Paul Churchin comment on Twitter earlier where he was talking about getting RotoWire's Fantasy Mag and still buying the hard printed magazine. Like, there's still a nostalgia for me. Like, I remember fantasy back when I first started doing it in the early 2000s. I think I actually first got into it in like 2000, 2001. And team defense was it. Like, you didn't have IDP. So, I still enjoy doing it just for more of the nostalgia feeling. But, I have my deeper leagues and I have my redraft leagues and I have everything in between. So I don't blame anybody, whatever your poison is. So we thank you guys always for hanging out. Next week, we are talking all team defenses all the time, and it'll be awesome. So make sure you tell a friend, tell a family member, tell someone else, tell everybody. And let's talk next week. Tomorrow night, we're going to be talking offense. It's the Dynasty Show. We're going to have our boy Taylor Cornell, and we're going to be having a good time tomorrow night. We love you guys. We will talk to you again soon, and take care of each other.
Also, right there, playlist. Hit it. Watch the videos. Do it. You want to.